Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel Zito. This is Rishu this side, and this is going to be our third video in the series of making your own load balancer. So in last two videos we talked about how we can make multiple backend servers, and we learned about how we can actually use multi-threading and start multiple servers and on the backend. So these two topics are covered. So in this video we'll cover this topic of how we can create a load balancer, and basically we are going to redirect our request from load balancer to our backend servers. So basically what we will cover is that we will create one server and we will create another server that will act as a load balancer. We go ahead and pass this request to the backend server. It will receive the request and then it will pass on to the client. So without further ado, let's head towards our editor. So first of all, for a load balancer to be there, we need a port where we will host our load balancer. So let me first create the main function for this. This will be our main function, which will actually go ahead and call our load balancer. So we can have our backend server. Say that let's say we will host our backend server on port 8081. So I'll just put in the address in a form of tuple because tuples are very type safe in Python. So let's call it localhost, and this will be hosted on our port 8081. So for running a backend server, I will just simply run this code which we earlier discussed in our last two videos, how we can run a server. So this code will actually go ahead and start a server for us. And for load balancer, this is going to be our main code. So here we have created our backend server that will be hosted on this port. Now I will call a function start load balancer that will take in a port at which port we want to start the load balancer. Let's say we want to start a load balancer at port 9000. Now we need to create our start load balancer function. So start load balancer function that will take in port as an input, and we can write that code here. So if you don't know what is a TCP IP socket, I have talked about this in my video 1. I'll put that video's link on the iCard above, so you can go ahead and understand that how we are going to create socket. So what we will do is that we will create with socket.af. I have discussed what this AFIN is so in the first video, so you can go ahead and watch that. So socket.sockstream. I have also discussed what sock streams are. Now what we have to do is that we have to bind this socket to a port. So server socket dot bind is what we will use, and we will pass in our local host, and since we are hosting, and then we will pass in the port at the port where our load balancer will be hosted. Now what we have to do is that we have listen to the incoming connection. For listening to the incoming connection, we have to make our server socket listen that. So server socket dot listen is the inbuilt function which we can use. Post that, what we can do is that for logging purpose, which is generally a very good practice, we can say what we can log here is that okay, load balancer, and then this will be doing the logging for us on the terminal. Now what we can do is that we can go ahead and call, we'll run a while loop as long as the requests keep coming. We will accept this connection from the client. So for accepting a connection, what we can do, we can create socket client socket, and we also need a client address, and what we can call server socket dot accept. That will give us basically the client socket and the client address. If you are getting confused that what is this client socket, what is this client address, I have explained this in full detail in video number 1. You can go ahead and watch that. So now what we can do is that I'll use threading here because I will be creating for multiple servers. So for one server also I'll create one thread because that will make it easier for upcoming videos for me to explain that how everything is going. Even if you're not sure that how threading works, you can go ahead and watch the second video there. So okay, so what we can do is that threading.thread, this will take in the target. So target is basically the function which we want to call. So target is what I'll go ahead and call this handle client request. So this function will basically take all the calls, it will redirect it to the backend server, and then it will again take back all the responses from the backend server, and then it will throw it to the client. So this function will be called handle client, and the arguments that it will take is, so args that it will take is basically the client socket object. So we can call client socket, and this must be an iterable, that's why I'm putting a comma here, and we can start this thread. Cool. So our basically the start load balancer function is completed. Now what we can do is that we can go ahead and declare our handle client function. So this will take in my client socket as an object. Let's pass in, so here is that client socket, and then what we can do is that we can actually, okay, so and then this line represents what we call handle the connection, handle the connection in a separate thread. So here it is, and then in our handle client what we need to call is that, first of all, what we will receive is a request data. So we will call this variable as request data, and in request data what we will do is that client socket would bring in the request data for us. So client socket dot, if you want to know that how this thing is also working, so I have explained it in full detail in video 1. So this will be decoding. So request data is done. Now what we can do is that we can go ahead and from where did we receive that request. So what we can do is that print received request from, and this will basically give us the address where we received this request from, client socket dot get peer name. So this function will basically give us from where we are receiving this. Now we can also go ahead and print a request data. So request data is printed. Now what we can do is the, now again we have to create a socket object with socket dot socket. I'll just go ahead and copy it from here. That will be our server socket. This is our server socket, and this will be our backend socket. So at backend, where at what port we are actually binding it. So this will be our backend socket. Now post that when we have created, now we will have a backend address. So this will be our backend. So backend address will basically be the address of the host where we want to redirect this request. Since we are only going ahead and creating one server, so every backend address will be port 8081 only. So I am just hard coding this because since we are only running one server, but in upcoming videos I will show you that actually how a backend address is selected is where the logic for the load balancer lies. So the main logic how a load balancer will segregate different requests to different hosts, what happens is the main core concept of a load balancer, how it will redirect different requests to different hosts, lies here. So these are there are very different load balancer algorithms that you can go ahead and read about it. But for now, since there is only one, so I am going ahead and just passing in localhost, and then 8081 is my port. So that will be my backend address. And then what we will do is that we will call in backend socket. So backend socket dot connect, we will create a connection, and then we will pass in the backend address here. And then what we will do is that we will send in the request to the backend socket which we received. So backend socket dot send all. Send all is basically the function. So send all and request data dot encode. Since it is a good practice to send in encoded data, so we will send it that. So here we have completed our sending the data. Now when we have sent that data, it is time to receive the data. So for receiving the data, what we can do is that we can have a response data. So response data is what we will use. So backend socket, so backend socket dot receive, and we will receive it in 1024. This is the decoding that we will do, and then we will use print for login purpose, and then we can go ahead and the response from the response data, basically let's put it that way, the response data is, and we can put in the response data here. So it is response data. Cool. So response data has been received. Now what we have to do is that we have to get out of this loop. Now we have to send this data to client. So client socket dot send all, and when we are sending it, it will be response data. And then what we can do is that it we will close the connection. So client socket dot close all. So, close. So this will actually close my connection. So yeah, this is the code, and let's see how it is doing. So for starting a server, I'll go ahead and since 8081 is our only port, so I'll just remove these things and go ahead and start a port. I start a backend server. So you can see backend server is listening to port 8081. Now we can also check that whether my backend server is up and running or not. So let's call localhost 8081. Okay. So yeah, hello from backend server issue created. So 8081 is working. Now it's time we start our main load balancer. So let's run this program. Hmm. So okay, so it says that there is a syntax error. So yeah, it will be. So yeah, let's start to run this program. So let's run. So yeah, the load balancer is listening to port 9000. So let's go ahead and see how port 9000 is behaving. So localhost So when we hit 9000, it should redirect to 8081 and the response should be same as 8. Yeah, so you can see that it went to 8081 only when we are hitting port 9000. So how we can, so let's refresh this and again see how the call went. So this is the call. It went to port 9000, then it internally got redirected, and then what we can response is backend server that is created at port 8081. So when we can see here is that here see load balancer is listening to port 9000. Now received request, this is my local IP address, and then localhost 9000, the connection was kept alive. It was from Google Chrome, the request data, and then what we can see is that all other normal informations like what is the windows and everything, and the response data that we got from the backend server was http 200 hello from backend server that Rishu created at port this. And so yeah, this is how our load balancer is working. It is redirecting the request to one of the servers. Now in the next video we will learn that how we can redirect this request to multiple backend servers, and remember that in this backend address the whole logic of load balancing algorithm lies. So we will also discuss some of the load balancing algorithms in the next video. So until then, stay tuned, and if you like my content, please do give a like and subscribe to my channel. That motivates me to create more such videos. So yeah, thank you and happy learning. Bye bye.